Hey, I'm Alex,
And I'm Brandon.
and welcome to Living Electric.
We're both content creators and electric vehicle enthusiasts.
And through this podcast, we hope to share our experience with owning electric vehicles and help you join the electric life.
Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 4 of season 2 of Living Electric. I am making my comeback today.
That's right. Brandon's
Yes.
back on the mic.
Yes, I am. I hope you guys are ready for lame jokes at the end.
We missed out last week, I'll tell you that.
Right. Well, I'm definitely happy to be back. My head's feeling better, and I'm excited to talk about the future of electric vehicles.
Yeah, it's an exciting time to own an electric vehicle and just be in the EV industry. There's a lot happening, a lot of movements, a lot of changes. Of really a lot going on, but I think we can confidently say that robots are the future of vehicles, right?
At least according to Tesla, they are.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So obviously AI Day was yesterday with Tesla. We'll just do like a quick recap there, but basically I don't even understand like half of the stuff they're talking about, even with an engineering background, like the computer science and computer engineering and software engineering stuff they're doing on the back end of Autopilot is just insane. But like at a basic level, they've gone from just taking static images from like their Autopilot cameras to now like doing video and 3D mapping like the world around their cars to help with self-driving.
That's crazy.
It's insane. And part of their Autopilot system is training their neural net, I guess, to understand certain situations and actually like make decisions on how to drive the car, what to do in certain situations. And to train that neural net, they had to develop their own chip because like nobody's making anything that can do something like this. So they made this super modular chip and are creating this like insane supercomputer to train this software, I guess, or this neural net that's going to go inside all the Autopilot cars. So that's about as much as I understood. And at the end, they're like, "Oh yeah, we made a robot too because we're pushing the boundaries of AI and like we might as well make a robot if we're gonna go at it." So
yeah, I pretty much all I saw was that cringy video of that person dressed up as the robot dancing to Bangarang by Skrillex.
Yeah.
And I literally looked at Tyler this morning. I'm like, nothing screams the future like a Skrillex song from 2011.
You're so right.
Yeah, but it's unbelievable. So the cameras on the Model 3 and like the other Tesla vehicles are pretty much training this supercomputer to pretty much.
That's kind of what they touched on, and like I would just encourage you to go rewatch the whole presentation, even if you don't understand it. Just some of the demos they showed of like the stuff they're doing is insane. But yeah, they're taking essentially all of the data from all the video they've recorded on Autopilot in all their cars and then dropping into this huge, large computer database and then like parsing through it all to decide like how it should handle certain situations, what it did good, what it did bad, what it should do next time, all that stuff. So the craziest thing I think they talked about, at least from what I remember, obviously lots of crazy things, but the craziest thing I heard is that when their cars are driving on Autopilot, at least this is how they foresee it, they don't just run Autopilot on the car you're driving. They also run the Autopilot like neural net on every other car that is moving around you to predict what it's going to do next.
So pretty much like multitasking.
Yeah, essentially. Which, I mean, if you think about it, you're kind of doing that as a driver when you're driving around. If you're like, oh, that person is not slowing down at that stop sign, I bet they're going to blow right through that. I'm not going to go forward at the stop sign. Like you're kind of doing it yourself. But the fact that they're like running these calculations on every single car, like you can probably only focus on like maybe one or two. Like it can do like 8 or 9. Like just crazy. Like
wow. And you know the thing that blows my mind is that all this is already implemented within the Teslas that are already driving around. Like
at least on the hardware side, they're saying that like, hey, with the camera setup we've got now, we can do a lot of this stuff, but they are going to release like an updated version of the full self-driving computer, which I think is kind of a given. They've got to continue to iterate on that.
Yeah. I think I read that the Cybertruck is going to have full self-driving computer too. I think that's what they're calling it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's crazy. You know, I think about what my Bolt can do, and it cannot do
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
The exciting thing is that Tesla is doing a lot of cool stuff there, but if you even think about like how advanced they are with their self-driving tech, that we still don't have like level 5 self-driving, I think that's
Yeah.
almost a little daunting too, to say like, oh, full self-driving is going to be coming in 2 years. Like I still am kind of on the fence about committing to something like that soon. I think there's just so
Yeah.
many like edge cases, so many random weird situations you run into as a driver that like a computer just can't handle. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And like another aspect that I think of is that like at night. I mean, like a lot of things being vision based, I can imagine when things get darker, it might be like more impaired and won't
yeah.
pick up on things that it would typically in the daylight. It's so funny. I remember when I worked at Tesla and like Autopilot was like first released, you know, like Autopilot 1, and everybody was talking about like the different levels of like self-driving, and how like level 5 is obviously, you know, like the apex of self-driving. But what does that look like in terms of hardware and software, and like
Yeah.
how, like what do you add to the car to make it that? It's, I mean, because you look at systems from like Waymo and like some of those other self-driving, and they have like LiDAR sensors everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's like, our car's eventually going to look like that. Yeah, or can you at least make it a little bit more aesthetically appealing
Definitely.
to people? Yeah,
Definitely.
it's gonna be interesting.
For sure. Yeah, so that's on the self-driving side. I think it's fair to say, even if you're a Tesla critic, I think they are really pushing the boundaries of self-driving. Like obviously Autopilot has its problems, they have issues with it, but I think just the amount of data they've been able to collect and the like way they're pushing that forward has been like insane. So I think they're
Oh
still
yeah,
kind of at the forefront there and really pushing the boundaries. But lots of other vehicles now. I don't know how many you've driven like recently that also have like very similar autopilot like features.
yeah, yeah. Our ID4 has some like lane keep assist features where like it'll actually keep you in the lane, and it does a decent job. But there is definitely a lot of like back and forth between like the lane markings and
Oh, like ping ponging back and forth.
yeah, there's been some times where like if like a lane marking like kind of like disappears and then it kind of like opens up again, you can feel the whole steering wheel like jerk. And
Oh,
it's
yeah.
very like, what is happening?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and don't even get me started with our Bolt. It doesn't have like anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, but I would say the closest to autopilot would probably be the ID4 that we own.
Gotcha.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's all that basic autopilot is. I don't know if a lot of people really realize that when they see all this like full self-driving stuff. The standard like basic autopilot is just adaptive cruise control, which means it'll like maintain your speed, but it'll slow down if somebody's in front of you, and lane keep assist, so it'll keep you in your lane when you're on the highway. Like that's literally all basic autopilot does. It just reads the lane lines and kind of keeps you put. So when you get into like turns and all that stuff, that's when you get into like the more advanced self-driving features that you got to pay for.
Alex, you have full self-driving, right? Like
Have
at least the package.
I have enhanced autopilot,
Oh,
which
enhanced
kind of
autopilot.
splits the
Okay.
difference between basic autopilot and full self-driving. So I've got essentially all of the usable full self-driving features that are available right now. So mine can do basic autopilot, but then it can also do navigate on autopilot. So it'll take interchanges and stuff like that. It'll do
wow.
complete like cloverleaf interchanges and stuff, which is insane to like sit in the car and feel. But then it'll also do just like regular lane changes. If I hit the turn signal, like it'll change lanes for me. And then I've got like smart summon and basic summon, like that, some of that stuff that's more kind of gimmicky for in the parking lot.
Yeah.
But,
Which is always fun.
oh yeah, it's still fun.
Fun to see people's reactions. Have you had a chance to try some of like the self-driving features like in the rain or like in the snow?
So anytime I'm on the highway, I put on autopilot. So like I've driven in all kinds of conditions, in the snow, in the rain, in the fog. Like the only time that it really has a major issue is when it can't see the lane markings very well. So if it is like very heavy rain and like I can't see the lane markings, then autopilot will say like, hey, I can't do this anymore. You got to take over. So that has happened, but I was driving through like dense fog one time and it could still like do autopilot because it could still see the lane lines okay. The radar was in front, so like if anything popped in front of us, it would slow down. But
Yeah.
I've been very impressed with it, like in the rain. The most I've really seen, unless it's like completely like thunderstorming, crazy hard rain, it'll just turn off the navigate on autopilot. So it won't change lanes or anything like that, but it'll still do the basic autopilot and like keep me driving straight, which is pretty insane.
Yeah, that's really impressive.
Mm-hmm.
So a little piece of your effort went into Tesla bot, pretty much.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you can say that a little piece of that is in every Tesla bot.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of Tesla bot, I actually haven't had a chance to look too much into it. Did they announce pricing of that?
No, it was just like,
yet.
hey, this is something we're working on. We might have a prototype on it next year. That was about all they said.
Oh,
but they gave like some specs on it. The funny part was when like Elon was up on stage talking about it, he's like, we've built it so that you can outrun it and also probably like overpower it if necessary. He's like, we're not creating like a killing machine robot. We're creating like a very easily overpowered robot.
That's great.
So it's 5'8". It has a carrying capacity of 45 pounds, 125 pound weight of the machine, can deadlift 150 pounds, and an arm extend lift of 10 pounds. And then it can only move at 5 miles per hour. So if you could run faster than 5 miles per hour, which is like a little bit faster than a brisk walk, then you'll be okay.
I'm so glad they thought about all of this.
I know.
I will say, though, as the day went on, I started thinking of things that, like, a Tesla bot could do for me.
Yeah.
I'm like, laundry, grocery shopping, cleaning the house. I kind of want one, but 2020 was supposed to be the magic year of electric vehicles. A lot of manufacturers promised a lot of things in the year 2020, and some came to fruition, some did not.
Yeah.
However, as the days go by and the years go by, a lot of manufacturers are dedicating themselves to go fully electric by a certain point. I know Volvo, for example, is going to be fully electric by 2030. Ford is offering an entire electrified lineup. GM is obviously, dedicating a lot of effort into electric vehicles. So expanding the market of electric vehicles, I think, is going to happen pretty rapidly.
I think a lot of companies have realized that like this is what consumers want. It's not because companies wouldn't make electric vehicles unless people were going to buy electric vehicles. It's not just like, hey, this is something we're doing just because. I think people have realized, and if you look at surveys and stuff, like a majority of people say that their next vehicle is going to be electric, or that when prices come down, my next vehicle is going to be electric, or when range is better, my next vehicle is electric. Like there's a couple things that like kind of need to change, but like a lot of people are looking into it and want to drive an electric vehicle. It's just they're waiting for the right one for them.
And I think obviously, as we know, with like technology improving and the price of battery packs come down pretty much every single year, I give it, I don't know, just a few more years and there's going to be an electric vehicle for everybody, like in terms of like the price point.
Yeah.
Not trying to steal General Motors like new tagline, EV for everybody, but I definitely think that there's going to be plenty of options.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I know when I worked for Tesla, 2015, the electric vehicle market was at only 1% of all cars on the road here in the US, and it's 2021 and we're seeing 3%. So, I mean, that's a lot of cars, I think.
And that's a big increase, and that's 3% of like new vehicle sales, I think, right?
Yeah.
That's not total
correct.
vehicles on the road.
That's new vehicles. Yeah.
So, I mean, even just from a few years ago, I mean, 1% to 3% doesn't sound like a lot, but that's like a 3 times increase. Like, like that's a big jump. Yeah. So I think a lot of people are waking up to that. And like you were saying, like a few years ago, people didn't have a lot of options in EVs as well. Like the Model S for Tesla was kind of like the premier electric vehicle, but that started at like 80 grand and only had 250-mile range, which nowadays is like entry level, I feel like, for a lot of vehicles. Like that's kind of the minimum.
Yeah, it's actually funny you mentioned that because a lot of the electric vehicles that start at 40,000 have 250-mile ranges. Yeah. So
essentially half the price and similar range to 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, which is just to me amazing.
because right now I know like both of us being content creators, we keep up with a lot of the EV market and what vehicles are coming out. I know when we both started, we like covered a lot of the EVs, even if we couldn't see them, like we would do a video about them. And now like I can't even keep up with how many vehicles are being released every year. So
I mean, it's crazy how many cars are starting to be offered with a plug, you know, like whether it's like a plug-in hybrid or like a battery electric. Yeah. It's almost like every time you turn around, there's a new car. And not just talking like in the United States. I mean, like the EV market, like in China and in Europe, is just expanding like crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts.
It's almost like every day I see like 4 or 5 new electric cars for like the Chinese market. It's unbelievable.
Have you noticed, you mentioned like electrified options. Have you noticed that people will look at plug-in hybrids first before jumping to a full electric? For the non like EV enthusiast, do you feel like people are like, oh, let me try the plug-in first before I jump into like full battery electric?
So I think it depends on the consumer, because like I have noticed that some people do that, but I think when people start doing more research, they realize that a lot of electric cars offer the range that's comparable to some of these plugins. For example, I was doing research. There is a plug-in 7 Series and BMW 7 Series. It gets 19 miles on a full charge, but 290 miles with a full tank of gas, like total.
Oh, so
which is like, why, you know, it's so comparable compared to like a Model S, or I mean, even the Model S destroys that range. So and it's around the same price point, you know? So I think once consumers start doing more research and they start getting more educated on what's out there, they stray away from the plug-in hybrids, because it's complicated. You know, it's 2 powertrains in one body.
For sure.
You know, 2 things could go wrong.
So do you foresee eventually, like, I think price is the big one and range are kind of the main 2. I think charging kind of like finds its own way with home charging and that kind of thing. When both of those are at a level where like it's comparable to a gas car, or people are like, oh, this costs just as much as the other car I was looking at and has just as much range, do you think people are gonna switch to full electric, or do you think we'll still have a role, at least on the passenger side, for like gas and diesel vehicles?
That's a really good question. I think that there's a lot of work that needs done before everybody. And to be honest, I think it's unrealistic to think that every consumer is going to want to go fully electric.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah.
And I just think that there's a lot of education that still needs to be done before that's even a thought. I definitely think that there still will be a place for gas and diesel power cars, but in terms of like the sheer amount of them, I don't think it will be what it's like today. I think we'll see where there's like a shift where electric vehicles start becoming more of the norm and gas cars start to fade away. But I think until there's some type of like government regulation where there cannot be any air pollution being produced from like a vehicle, they're still going to be on the road. Yeah, I kind of had that moment the other day where I was thinking about it, and I'm like, it'd
so
be nice.
I mean, obviously, it's going to take some time to get them off the road, but do you think there'll be a time where like we go to like 80 or 90% of new car sales are battery electrics?
Totally. Yeah, and I think that's where that price point comes into,
definitely,
as well as like the education perspective to this whole thing. I think once we can get the price point down where everybody can afford it, not just people who, you know, are more middle class, more upper class, but like everybody can afford it. I think that's when we'll start seeing that shift.
Yeah. And I've told people too that are looking at an EV that are like, I just can't afford it right now. And I'm like, I completely understand. Like it's clearly like you've got to kind of make a commitment, not only on the like just technology side of trusting a new technology, but then you're also like have that financial investment as well, where you're kind of putting extra money into something that you may or may not like if you haven't done, if you're just kind of like just need a new car. So I thought that's been interesting as well. And I usually tell people like, hey, this is still a very new thing. I think one thing that's going to help immensely is when this market gets a lot bigger and there's more used vehicles on the market as well. Because that helps pull the gas market down a little bit, because you can go pick up a like very good reliable used car nowadays
Oh, totally.
and save a ton of money over a brand new car. Like like
Yeah.
depreciation on cars is insane just because they lose a ton of value. But we really
Yeah.
haven't seen that with EVs just because everybody that buys them generally likes them a lot and isn't going to sell them. Like it's almost
Yeah.
as cheap to just buy a brand new EV versus buying a used one. Yeah, so I think I feel like that's really the biggest thing that is holding people back from at least like taking a chance on an electric vehicle. Not that even like you're really taking a chance, but like kind of making that jump into a new type of car is that price point, because you're like, I'm not going to spend twice what I normally would pay just to have an EV, at least for the normal car buyer in my experience. But then range is the other thing. Obviously we've seen that like increase a ton. I don't foresee like, I guess this is probably a good question. What do you think is like the range point where like people will compare it to a gas and you're like, okay, that's enough range? Where they're like, okay, it's like an equal playing field between gas and electric.
Well, honestly, I think you could kind of turn that into the other way around. I think people will actually start getting over the range aspect once vehicles start charging faster. Because I know for me, we've always owned sub 300-mile range electric vehicles.
Yeah.
And we have no issue living with them. I mean, like at most we'll see about 260 miles like on our, Bolt or like our ID4. But it's the charging speed. So like I think once the charging technology improves, I think more people will kind of look past the range. But I definitely think it has to be over 200. I know for me, I wouldn't consider anything below 200 miles.
I gotcha.
Yeah. What about you?
Yeah, it's so hard with this question because this is the first thing people ask when they're looking at an EV or like see that I drive a Tesla. They're like, oh, well, how far can you go on it? And I'm like, well, I can get 300 miles, but I don't drive 300 miles every day.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are really realizing that. They're like, oh, well, I maybe take like one trip a year where I have to drive like 4 or 5 hours to like go on vacation or whatever. But like the rest of the time I'm driving to work and like driving to the grocery store, like driving my kids to practice. Like
less than 50 miles a day.
Most of your trips are just so close to home. And that's what I generally tell people if they're like looking at an EV is like, pick up like a used Leaf. Like even if it's got a 100-mile range, you can use that for zipping around town for like just about everything. Like and save money on maintenance and everything else.
Yeah. If you think of it, like all the errands, like I know that a few years ago, I think the EPA actually announced to save emissions, you should plan your errands to be either one or two places versus like going one place, like all over the place. If you got an electric car, if you need to go to 5 places, then you're set.
Yeah.
You won't be producing emission.
But I think that's a very critical piece that I think people need to understand if they're shopping for an EV is understand what your needs are. And I think we've talked about this in previous episodes too, so I won't like rehash it a ton, but I think that education point really needs to be like pushed home on people. Is we really don't need. You probably don't need a 400 or 500 mile range car. Like for like, think about what kind of driving you do. You probably don't need that much range. But the flip side of that, I think there are certainly people that do need that much range. Like
True.
I was talking I had lunch with the dean of our engineering school actually the other day. He's actually looking at a Model 3. We went on a test drive and stuff, and it was
nice.
really cool seeing his reaction to everything. He's like, this has impressed me a lot from like even from like the videos and photos I've seen. I'm like, yeah, that's great. He said like the only thing that's really holding me back is the range, because he travels a lot just like for his job. He's in the car a lot driving. And he's like, I don't know if like on my schedule and the amount of driving I do, like I would really like to have like 450 miles to like drive those long distances. And I'm like, yeah, that's fair. Like if you are going to be driving a lot for work and like don't want to stop at charging stations, like you can definitely do it. Like I'm traveling a lot more for my new job and have been taking my car everywhere, and it's been great, but not everybody wants to do that. So I think there's certainly situations where I think gas will still have a role where people are doing a lot more traveling. But I think for like a daily car, for a car you're just using to get around town, like EVs are already a great option. I don't think you need to wait for like the new new generation of EVs to come before you like, this works for me.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, I think it just goes back to the education standpoint. Like, just inform yourself of what's out there and make the right choice for you.
Yeah.
I was thinking too, especially if gasoline still has a part in transportation in a few years, at least that's where the plug-in hybrid side comes in. Because we're seeing plug-in hybrids with increasing amount of electric range. So you could potentially get a plug-in hybrid, do all of your errands and commute on electricity, and then not even use gas for the majority of the time of ownership. So, I mean, who knows where that technology is going to be,
For sure.
You might not even use gas at all.
And I think that's what a lot of people realize when they get a plug-in hybrid is they're like, oh, like, I don't really ever use gas and I'm only using like the 30-mile range in my plug-in hybrid. They're like, I could definitely get an EV. Like,
absolutely.
Some people make that connection. They're like, oh, I really don't actually drive that much. So
I think it's just all about, understanding your position and like what kind of ownership you're looking for.
So outside of vehicles, what do you think the future of charging looks like? I know it's kind of the Wild West right now in terms of charging. At least that's how I feel. There's like so many different plug types. There's different charging brands. There's different like vehicles. Some like Tesla has their own brand of chargers. Like, what do you see that whole future playing out like?
So, well, first I want to say I don't think it's going to look like those like animations you see like on YouTube Shorts or TikToks. I don't know if you've seen those. They're like,
no, I haven't.
I'll send them to you. They're like really poorly rendered videos, and like it's like the Apple car, and like it's like a crane comes out, picks it up, and sticks it to the side of a building. And I'm like, okay, this is not how the future is going to be, and if it is, I don't want to be a part of it. Like, no,
you get a forklift at every parking lot.
Just no, thank you, no thanks. So I think eventually in the future we're going to get away from, like the Tesla CCS CHAdeMO. I think J1772 will still have a part in everything just because it is a part of CCS.
Yeah.
But I think the CCS connector standard will become the standard. I just see that happening. I mean, Tesla's already putting it on their superchargers in Europe. Yeah. And I believe in Asia. I think we're going to see that here too.
Yeah, I'd agree with that sentiment. I think Tesla's realized too that in order to push EVs forward, they've already said that they're going to open up superchargers to other non-Tesla vehicles in the future. So eventually I do hope we get to some kind of unified standard. The only dislike I have with the CCS is that it has like that separate connector, or that separate like flap for DC charging, whereas the Tesla port, like the engineering like design nerd in me is like, that thing is beautiful. It can do like level 1, level 2, and level 3 like DC. It can do it all in this tiny little cord. Whereas, like, if you hold up a Tesla core next to a CCS, like, the CCS is huge. Like, it's gigantic.
It's chunky. Yeah,
so
it is.
That's really my only quip with it. But if we got to a unified standard where, like, okay, every charger has a CCS, like, I'd be completely on board with that. That'd be so much easier than, like, me as the Tesla driver carrying around, like, 4 different adapters to charge at all these different stations. So... yeah, I would definitely love to see that, and I think we will get to that eventually, because we saw a similar thing with gas. I didn't really do a lot of research on this, but gas, like the ports, like where you put in the gas pump, like that's a standardized size on every car now, which is like kind of a weird analogy, but it's similar.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's funny you brought that up, because diesel ports are a little bit thicker.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah, when we had our TDI, and please don't everybody be shocked that we had a diesel. The typical like gas pump doesn't fit in a diesel port.
Interesting. Okay.
I'm using EV terms for gas.
A diesel port, yeah.
Diesel port.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it just doesn't fit. And it's part of a safety reason, too, so you don't accidentally put diesel into your gas car and destroy it. But I think they're only off by like a few centimeters or something like that.
Yeah, I know. So I'd like to see that, just like a unified port. I would also like to see a universal way of starting a charge as well, which I think we're starting to get to. I don't know if you saw that, like, a bunch of EV charging companies have banded together to create this roaming feature. I don't know if you heard about that or not.
I did see
where
that.
like
Yeah.
you can activate a charge with like your favorite EV charging app. So like certain stations are compatible with like multiple apps versus just using the station's like or that manufacturer's app, which is really nice. So
that is nice.
well, I was going to say that I think people have their preferred like EV app in certain ways and like have their payment. They just want to have one account. They don't want to have like 6 different accounts with a bunch of different manufacturers, a bunch of different chargers, just to get a charge started. So just having like one account, one app, you can see all the chargers and you can activate the charge with that. That would be like so easy.
Yeah. If things could just be universal, I think that's a big hurdle for everyday drivers.
Yeah.
It's just because you show up at a station and it might be confusing, like it might be labeled 5 different things and you really just have no idea to start it. Yeah. But I agree. If things could just be simplified in the future, I think that would really help with adoption.
And I think we've really got to look to gas too, which like feels bad, but you've got a consistent fueling experience every time you go to a gas station. You know exactly what to do. Like what kind of like type of gas you got to put in your car. You got to like swipe your card the same way at every station. Like it's all pretty streamlined. So
and I don't think there's anything wrong taking the concept of going to a gas station and like refueling your car and like applying it to electric vehicles.
No, not at all.
Especially if there's snacks involved. I think
right.
if there was like some type of like convenience store. But like I think if like you can take that aspect and like something that people are comfortable with and then utilizing it.
Definitely.
Yeah. I think that would help out a lot. So on the topic of charging, how do you think charging technology is going to improve?
The majority of charging, I think, in the future, and I don't think people really like realize this, is that we don't need as many gas stations as we do charging stations. That just like simply is not the case. Like we do not need as many because most people, like we said earlier, are going to be charging in and around town or driving in and around town and charging at home overnight. And the way it is in the US, at least, a majority of people own a home and are able to charge at home. At least like that's how it is where we live. That's how it is the majority of houses like I'm familiar with. You have some place to park. Even if it's on the street, you're able to install some sort of charger to plug your vehicle in overnight. Now, the other part of that, I think, is building out our DC fast charging network. That is definitely a huge task. The kind of limit to that right now is there's not a lot of money to be made in selling electrons at a fast charging station. That's just the way it is, unfortunately, with the high cost of installing a DC fast charger just because of how much power it pulls. You're really not going to see a return on investment right now just because of just because electricity is so cheap and most people do charge at home. It's way cheaper to just plug in at home, but also the utilization rates of these fast chargers are so low just because there's not a lot of vehicles on the road. So there's not even a lot of people coming up to the charger to plug in. So the incentive for people to install these fast chargers just isn't really there. Now, obviously there's like lots of ways to fix that, but I think kind of figuring that out in a way, like, I guess politically to like kind of support that and build out the infrastructure, because it's such a chicken and egg problem. It's like, what do you build first? Do you increase EVs or do you build more chargers? Like you got to kind of do both at once.
Yep.
So
definitely.
So I don't know if that really answered your question on the charging technology, but
no, I definitely think it did. Yeah, it's interesting because it's like, as I mentioned earlier, like taking like the concept of a gas station and kind of like utilizing like the process in terms of how people interact with the charger. But I don't necessarily think that we need the amount of DC fast charging stations, like in terms of locations, that there are the amount of gas stations.
Yeah.
I think once people kind of get over that hurdle and realize that the majority of their charging is going to be at home, they'll be more comfortable with that. But in terms of like long distance road trips, that's when I think an infrastructure would be good.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, on the technology side, I think kind of back to that I didn't really touch on is just like the charging speeds, because like people expect charging to just like increase in speed. The other part of that is just the charging curves of EVs is kind of difficult. So like on my car, when I plug in, like my car can handle up to 250 kilowatts, which is like pretty much on the high end of like what vehicles can take right now if you're not like familiar with charging rates. But if I plug in at a station that can provide that much power, I'm only charging at that rate for like from like 5 to 15 or 20%. Like once I get past that, the kilowatt level like drops off and my charging rate is about the same. So I think like not only batteries, but like there's a lot of like physics stuff involved too. I'm not sure like how much just like putting out higher powered chargers is going to help us that much.
Yeah, I agree. It's almost like what you mentioned earlier, like the chicken and the egg. I think
Yeah.
the technology of the battery has to get to the point where it's like a steady, consistent rate of charge, and then things will be more even, I guess you could say. Yeah.
Well, and it's hard to do just from a physics level too, because as you put more electrons into the battery, the harder it is to fit more electrons in. So the lower the charge rate is. Because like the analogy is like when you put an electron into a battery, it's got to go find a place to like sit, I guess. Like if you think about like, I guess like a good analogy would be like kids running into like a classroom or something like that. Like
you're helping me understand this.
At first, like you can have like a ton of kids, like say there's like 40 seats in the classroom, there's 40 kids outside. At first, like a ton of kids can go in real quickly because they can all find a seat real quick. But then like once seats start filling up, like the trickle of kids coming in and finding a seat is going to be slower because they're searching around trying to hunt and find a seat. Right.
Yeah.
So it's similar to that.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful you just gave that that explanation because honestly that put things into my mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely understand that better now. Yeah, you know, it's funny. I mean, like I don't know if technology like this exists, but like I wonder if there's almost like a charging station that like adds and removes equal amounts, or maybe like even like removes lower amounts, so like it allows like the rate of charge to be consistent. Like I don't know how that would work in terms of like
that's
engineering,
like
if
that's
even-
kind of like the physics problem. Like you're almost like you can't break physics when you're charging a car is the problem. So I think that'll always be a problem. But we have seen with vehicles like the Ticon, it's got that 800 volt architecture versus a 400 volt on most cars. So increasing to that higher battery voltage actually helps with charging rates too. And the main advantage there, I'll try not to get too technical again, but the main advantage there is like voltage and current are kind of like inversely proportional. So if you increase voltage, you lower current. But current is the part that makes things like hot and makes things overheat. So if you increase the voltage and lower the current, you're lowering how much heat is going to the battery, and you're also can push more power through at a lower current because you've got that higher voltage, if that makes sense. So if you plug in so if you plug in a Ticon, it's got that 800 volt architecture. Let's say it's pulling a typical car pulls 100 amps. If you plug in a Ticon at that 800 volt architecture, that higher voltage, that's going to drop to 50 amps. So you can push just as much power through, but then you're not like overheating the cable. So that's kind of the advantage of using that 800 volt architecture, and can actually help with charging speeds.
So do you think we're going to see that implemented in other cars? Because like I know like the Ioniq 5 and like some of the other Hyundai products they're coming out with have architectures like that.
Yeah.
It's almost surprising we haven't seen something like that in Tesla.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could definitely see that. And I'll tell you, most of the chargers we're deploying, and this is public information too. You can look up like spec sheets of charging stations on their websites, but most charging stations being deployed, at least the higher powered ones, can do over 800 volt charging. So they're capable of charging at over 800 volts.
Wow.
So that is definitely an advantage. And like I said, the big advantage there is you can use like smaller cables because they don't need to handle as much current, and that helps with cost. So yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm curious now to see how things like play out, because like the Ioniq 5 is supposed to be around like $45,000. So and supposedly it has that standard. So
yeah, I could definitely see it going that way. I did a little bit of research on battery architectures in the past, and the reason like 400 volts is the way it worked out is just because that's what a lot of like off-the-shelf parts would handle, like for the battery management system or whatever.
Yeah.
But also it's how like the individual cells are all lined up. So you've got like all those individual cells, but the way they're like stacked together in series and parallel throughout the entire pack, it just like it equals out to about 400 volts. But you can reconfigure it however you want. Like if you want to do 800, you could build a 1,000-volt car. Like you can do whatever, but it's just kind of making sure it works with chargers and works with your other electronics in the car, not just the chargers. So
interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, it's good that I was going to say it's good that we have an electrical engineer as a co-host.
I hope some of that makes sense. I'm sure I messed some stuff up too, because that's not like my area of expertise. It's just something I know about a little bit. So
no, I think it makes sense. I mean, the whole kids finding seat thing or like explanation like that definitely helped me understand it.
Yeah, I just thought that up on the fly too. That was good.
Yeah, well, I liked it. I think you should copyright that before someone takes it.
Yeah, really.
Well, I was just going to say, how do you feel about wireless chargers? Like, there are some on the market right now, and I just know from wireless charging my phone, it overheats all the time. It never seems to be reliable at all. Do you think that that's like a valid option for like future charging?
Okay, so I'll tell you this as my kind of stance on it, engineering wise, with wireless charging. And I usually look at things from an efficiency aspect and like a cost aspect are kind of the two things I look at. Is the problem I have with wireless charging, it is not very efficient way of transporting power. The best way to transport power is always going to be a direct plug-in connection no matter what. Like you can't past that. That's just how electricity works. Like you're never gonna be more efficient at moving power. But I mean, there's also the convenience aspect as well. So is it easier to just roll into your garage and your car is charging and you don't have to worry about plugging anything in? That's certainly more convenient. But the part you miss out on, because it is more efficient or less efficient with wireless charging, is you're going to end up paying more. So I'm not sure the numbers on like how efficient it is, but let's say it's 70% efficient and you generally spend like $50 a month on your electric bill to charge your car. You're now going to be spending like, I don't know what the math is on that, but you're gonna end up spending more money essentially to charge your car the same amount. And I don't know if people like that when they're like, oh, well, I'll just plug in my car. But there is also like the cost of convenience too. But I don't think plugging in a car is that inconvenient that people are gonna put in a like wireless charger in their garage and B like not worry about the extra time it takes to like plug in your car, because we already do it with everything else, like plugging in your phone, plug it in your everything else.
Yeah.
So
exactly. So on the topic of like things being inefficient, especially with like wireless charging, it's interesting that some states are kind of like testing the waters with like wireless charging roads and like lanes. Because like I can't imagine driving on a road for like a quarter mile or half a mile. Who knows how expensive these roads are going to cost, or how much money they'll cost. But how much charge would you get in that short amount of time? So it's almost like just install the charging station at like the plaza, down the road. Like use that money more wisely. That's where like I honestly don't think wireless charging, I think until like technology improves, for me personally, I don't think it's going to go very far anytime soon. And I think a lot of people's frame of reference is phones too, because they're like, oh, well, like wireless charging is so convenient with a phone. It's like, well, yeah, it's a like small little piece of technology. Like you don't really have to line up the phone 100% every time. It can just be kind of like close to the coil and it'll start charging. And we don't really notice like if it's going to cost more. Like nobody like breaks down how much charging their phone costs. Like no, the battery pack is so small.
It's not pulling that much power. So So it's really not that big a deal, and I think that's a great like thing to have is wireless charging for phones. It's so much easier to just like plop it down on a charger. Like if you're just going about your day and have your phone sitting there to your side, like it's really convenient. But for something as big as a car and with as big a battery as a car, I don't think it makes a lot of sense. At least right now, like we could see that in the future that wireless charging has some kind of leap and like it's way more efficient than it used to be. But I don't know.
as long as it's not on the side of a building, like
that's
those
right.
videos.
Yeah, jeez.
Yeah, I can't wait to share those with you. You're gonna be like, "What is it?"
Yeah.
So, as usual, I feel like these are infamous lame jokes at the end of our episodes. Well, here's today's. The past, the future, and the present all walked into the bar at the same time. I guess you could say it was tense.
Oh my gosh. That might be one of your best ones. That was pretty clever.
Right. I'll be here all night. Well, I'll be in episode 5.
Sweet. So that'll do it for this episode of Living Electric. If you have any questions or want to share your thoughts on the future of electric vehicles, definitely let us know. You can hit us up on social media on Twitter at livingelectric_, on Instagram, Living Electric Podcast, and on Facebook at Living Electric Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we will see you in the next episode.